I am a couple miles into my walk. So what I'm trying to tie together, and by the way, that last live, man, I set my earphones down right next to playing that Mr. Mythos clip, and I guess I obfuscated the microphone. So I'm trying to get in a walk because my older son finally took my younger son out to. He's doing a volunteer at the SPCA working with animals. I'm so proud of him. And it really took a collective, but it's really a junction point that we reach, and he's been diagnosed with schizophrenia many years on now, on meds, trying to teach himself efficacy, right? And you can give people all the tools in the world, but it doesn't mean that they're going to take to it. And I'm not talking about my son in a derogatory way. Some people, like this concept of gremlins that we were talking about in the prior video, that again, I apologize. I was playing a clip of Mr. Mythos, set my earphones down, and I guess I was obnubulating the microphone, and it was just muffled for about 5 minutes while I was making some tea. maybe like 3 or 4 minutes, but still, it's kind of annoying. I'm not looking at the screen right now, so I don't know who's tuning in. But what I want to talk about is what I was discussing in the prior live today, was when you take all these areas of technical interest and the things that you do every day and that you regard as completely removed, that this has nothing to do with the occult. This is not a ritual. This is not a process. And you begin to break things down, you will come to a hard fact as you study further into what you do, right? And go deep, that you can't remove any subject matter from an occult ritual that exists here today. And so when I'm talking about amino acids and the very diet that I'm on right now, where I'm going into orthomolecular nutrition, it ties directly in with Hameroff and Penrose, microtubules, aromatic amino acids, particularly excitatory amino acids, right? And already after 5 or 6 days, I'm noticing my skin clearing up, right? I'm noticing my skin get tighter. And that wasn't the initial goal, but it was all part of that's the aesthetics that tell you that the high protein nutrition plan is in effect, that it's actually making it a profound difference. So we get into the geometrical construct of what we see and what is being alluded to by specifically Hameroff. He loves talking about this. I highly urge you to look him up discussing this because it gets into some super freaky physics, right? But what are you really looking at through the optical lens of infrared? You're looking at it's your own phenomenon. When we talk about Neumann phenomenon, right? It's your own specific phenomenon with protein and light, right? Traveling through, stuck within, reverberating off of, mirroring, right? A lot of these concepts are looked at through the phenomenology of physics, right? And I do want to get into some other areas. Of course, randomly that just started to kind of freak me out was this bootstrap theory, right? Of a postulate, this guy traveling down the road, gets in a car crash, he lives, someone dies, he goes to check on them, he finds a note, the note's addressed to him, and he actually like killed himself and has to develop this time machine, right? And the note says, develop the time machine, right? So that story could be taken in a lot of ways, right? That we all tend to live within our own time. What's alluded to is that we're all errors, that we wouldn't even exist if this hadn't been used in a very diabolical way, to where these occult organizations and all the and then there's an infanticide hypothesis as well, right? To where um, so a lot of these physics theories go much deeper than just obvious outcomes, to where you have to take into account a multi-layer, multi-level, uh, multi-dimensional existence where you exist in other areas. And you know that they took this infrared technology that I played some clips on, and they did research on life after death. You know that they have the optics to actually watch the soul at some in some instances, because I do believe that many people do not have souls, that they are in fact produced to not have souls, right? That you get so far off track with this mimetic sequence. That is, a mimetic sequence implies a certain line of successive number subsets, and you're looking at a family line more like the forking off of a central system, right? You're all sharing off the same data set, and then each person could be seen as a mimetic sequence of potential probability, possibility, that the things you do, if you line up with certain events, right? So this is why this moral implication, but specifically that you need to see yourself stuck in a moral dilemma. And that's what cathartically, you could use the term metanoia, causes a change, an abrupt dynamic change in the direction that you're going in. Again, I don't mean to be rude, but I'm not looking down at all at the screen. I know there might be some comments. I'd be giving shout outs right now, but I'm walking because my son is doing an orientation today. I'm excited. He's 29. He's been very depressed. He lives with schizophrenia and several other issues, but that's the main component there that causes so much distress. And not until you begin to take on this suffering that is talked about with these afflictions, these theological, spiritual afflictions, right? Not until you begin to be the curator and the orchestrator of your own suffering, right? Do you begin to see change in your life, right? So, secondary, very much so, could be considered the process of the application, but the fact that you are going through the same process over and over again, and you're just given this, what seems like a wide array of potential possible scenarios, right? Trades, titles, skill sets. But when you break each and every one down, the approach is always the same. When you begin to reach a level of mastery, right? I was a master trainer. I'm not saying that I knew everything, but I knew everything that I needed to produce the quote unquote, you can't say any of us are perfect or that but when you get the measuring tape out and you begin to look at aesthetics, how do you come up with the perfect diet? How do you come up with the perfect exercise program, right? You're always going to be suffering through. There's always going to be a great amount of sacrifice. But I started to study philosophy, and that's what really bends your mind, is because you get into these geometrical constants that begin to, you look at the phi or the phi Fibonacci sequence, and you're like, this is what people's eyes are attracted to. This is where you see breasts or hips or, a shapely buttocks or a shapely chest or shapely arms or a symmetrical face, right? And you're not really looking for something in that other person, right? You're searching constantly for perfection and beauty because you're really searching for purity. So do you see the dichotomy? is that our eye is trying to use available light, protein structures, scanning, and scavenging throughout the world to find something that has meaning. And the meaning is only inferred because what we find is, like they say, beauty is only skin deep, right? There is absolutely nothing to do with the beauty of someone's internal self, right? That could be directly correlated toward the, the aesthetically perfect man or the Vitruvian man or woman, right? I think they call it the Adonis index, the Venus index. And this is how I trained people before I even knew what that term was. Like I found that high protein diets, constant exercise, right? That I call GIT training, that I'm doing right now as we speak. I've been doing this again for another a week, and the results are profound. You're not going to see a huge drop in body weight because you're taking in adequate calories. You can get into a lot of trouble with this. Not everybody should or could do this at certain times. I think anybody can do this, but that they have to prepare themselves for a great amount of suffering. It's hard to sleep. It's definitely hard to get walking and functioning. You are going through this sort of transmutation of that higher form of your better self. And there's very little, so you go into this weird spiritual space. I only use the term spiritual because it's like this liminal consciousness where I would reach this state after being living on nothing but protein powder, water, supplements, and then eventually starting to do more specific orthomolecular healing. So orthomolecular nutrition and sciences was developed by Linus Pauling, right? And he believed that vitamin C was this miraculous vitamin that could heal just about anything, right? And that he really, when you get into the study of orthomolecular sciences, nutrition, which by the way, Billy J. Saley got into the intricacies of this in her book, Heal with Amino Acids and Nutrients. She was on the President's Council for Post-Traumatic Stress Disorder. They've known the answer all along. You're going to see people outright plagiarizing and stealing a lot of her work. It's very dangerous work, right? Just like Michael Persinger's work, because what I'm trying to do is tie all this in together. What's considered demonology, I wouldn't come up with a word such as Nathaniel Gillis does, like necronetics. I see it from a completely different viewpoint. I think that it very much has to do with our own individual paracosm. I also have seen direct evidence to me, empirical evidence to me that I neither really could establish on the outer, banks of wherever I end and wherever you begin. And maybe there isn't a zone like that because I'm looking at these firewalls. I'm looking at the fact that our fascia is a firewall, right? I'm looking at these walls made of flesh, made of computational systems that say that this sphere of influence of information goes this far, and it has an aura, kind of like a Mendelbrot set, but more specifically like Metatron's cube, and that this energy then transfers into this unit, right? But when you get into a paracosm, right, that is at a young age, somebody creates their own world, and based on the contention of that is how many resources a person has available to them, whether or not they're born into nobility, right? What kind of skill sets they take on, what is already downloaded into them or uploaded into them without them even making an effort or trying. Like somebody who has a 210, 220 IQ, right? But that's only a superficial indication that they are able to go into these different data process algorithms, right, and mimetic sequences or chains as to understand how to complete the mimetic chain or the mimetic sequence to a greater part or a greater whole, right? Which will invariably start this algorithm out to where you could outright call it an automaton, right? Or an automaton also, right? So you have this functioning computational system that can exist on its own. You get into this pericosum, these bodies that were put in, right? And all of these attributes of resources and availability, and then also a connection to these nodes at certain time placings or time junctures within space time, right? That you look back in your life and you see things as events, but they are only dismissed as sort of a fantasy zodiacal, right? That gets into astrology and tarot, but it's undeniable because you see these events, right? And they can even be looked at. You can look at somebody's life events on a charting system, just like you do with the markets, right? The financial markets, and you begin to see these cycles. There's been some very pronounced books written on this, probably too many to name, but how this gets into psychology, how it gets directly into proteins and light, right? That we see depicted over and over again through the tarot, Rosicrucian artwork, and Masonic artwork, you know. And I give you a lot of points of reference here to start doing your own investigation. But very recently, over the last 100 years, there was a huge effort to block any of this phenomenon from really coming to see the light of day, the attributes that going into this and having it funded, bottom line, having research money put into this, having grants being granted into this. And the thing is that Dr. Michael Levin's work is working with all of this. He's looking into a microscope. It's being funded. He has huge funding. He admitted this recently, that there's a lot of people that are very influential at the highest levels of academics and probably going into, semiconductors and companies like Raytheon and so forth, right? That have these sort of, shadow corporations that you could never link like what's going on with Stephen Greer and the illusions with him being linked to the Mossad, right? That you see this huge operation, multi-level operation being carried out that's so multifaceted that once you get through and you look into one thing, you've missed something else entirely on the other side of the spectrum, such as what's going on with Lou Elizondo, Hal Puthoff, Jacques Vallée. All these people have recently really been discredited. Have you noticed that? So there was this big campaign to boost them up, this cycle, this peak, right? Of everyone talking about them and then being disappointed. And then all of a sudden, it's not just information comes out about each and every one of them. Gary Nolan backed away, By the way, Gary Nolan's partner in the Soul Foundation, it's so weird. He's linked up with writing a book about the Seth tapes, right? With Jane Roberts, who passed away of breast cancer. So did Dr. Carla Turner that I mentioned prior. And she was constantly being plagued with and attacked by and wrote a few books. And there are dead ends there as well, like where Dr. Carla Turner is discredited because when you go off and you look at the masquerade of angels that Ted Rice was involved in, he's much older. God bless his soul. I hope his health is well, but he is much older, and he was trying to come up with $50,000 to go move in with, I think, one of his daughters or granddaughters, because he was getting to the point where he really couldn't even, hold a thought. And so people were criticizing him in a few of his videos, talking about, because he was a psychic that worked with Dr. Carla Turner. So you see how there doesn't need to be this extravagant um, complex counter information, outright espionage system that just fully shows its head in our society, overvaluing information that could easily be just looked at as entropy, right? Or what we consider energy. Energy has to come from another place. There has to be an agitated field. That field response, that energy has to be instantly transferred over. And when you begin to break down the process, it's a very simple, very finite number of steps to go through this process that you might even call, etymology or, epistemology or ontology, right? But nomenclature does get into this, right? Where you have the naming of things and you begin to look at runes, Theban alphabet, the witches used, the Voynich uh, manuscripts, all sorts of strange writings that have to exist that nobody really fully embraces or understands how these are worked unless they're involved in the inner workings of these occulted organizations, right? But the main thing is, and what I look at, is that all these different layers, from there being a physical world around us that is fully alive and is going about its own metabolic function. In other words, you have a process, you have what's described as in this infrared, you have these demonic entities that have been seen. But you're looking at these demonic entities that are existent in Vietnam, right? Around where people are being killed. And the whole reason that we were there really is under great suspicion as to be very diabolical and evil itself. So what are you doing, right? You could almost say that that was an occult ritual being done. In Vietnam itself, just like what was it, Stalingrad, right, where both Stalin and Hitler were sending massive numbers of their own troops out to die without any winter weather. They were being sent out, some say, as a sacrifice or an offering by the thousands. You look at what's going on around the world, and you see that America is detested because there are very few mass casualties and losses that occur in this country when you really back up and you think about it. Sure, there are breakouts of mass murders and serial killers, right? Constantly. And then there are cataclysms, you link up Oklahoma City bombing, World Trade Centers, but is this all done systematically, ritualistically, to stave off a mass sacrifice event that is demanded by something that you might call Prometheus or Satana, right? Or even getting into Hathor, because this is what Chris Bledsoe, I guess, talks about. Ryan Bledsoe got into this, is that he identified this woman who basically, she makes herself appear like she's this holy mother, right? This divine mother, but she also shows herself almost like a Braxis, like she has different sides. There's the side that will sacrifice mass numbers of people, right? And the most heinous evil rituals, little children, that's what really bothers us all. And this doesn't discount that, but to say that if you're looking at a time machine and you look at the amniotic fluid, amnesia, having to forget, some people don't forget everything from their past lives, right? I'm not necessarily alluding to karma, dharma. I'm not alluding to that as being whole in itself or 100% something that you could get behind. What I'm talking about is a computational subset or a computational system that could be looked at more like, Conrad Zuse and Alan Turing coming up with this postulation where they reach this belief system in themselves that the universe is a data set, that it's a digital universe, that it is a numbers-based universe, right? So this ties directly into the geometry this ties directly into the geometry being used to sacrifice life, and the fact that when you get down to what we really are, you look at the DNA, you look at, again, we get into the genomic aspects of a number system or a digitized system. And again, it leads back to Michael Levin, because a lot of the things that he's doing, where he's looking at each and every organ being an entire ecosystem, right, of conscious life. This is what he talks about. I highly urge you to look into a series of his interviews, and then even more so, look at what he's interested in that he posts up on his academic content YouTube page. It's very fascinating, very interesting. But he talks about how memory itself has agency, right? So you almost think of that like, whoa, that's weird, right? Like agency itself has memory. Like if I have agency, if I can think, then I can establish memories. But how can you say memory has agency, right? And you begin to see what's being talked about broadly is this mirror effect, or even a chiral effect, where one image, like when you're looking in a mirror, you couldn't transpose like what appears to be your right hand, right? You couldn't transpose your actual right hand. Like if you turned around and you were able to get into the mirror, you're looking at a chiral image of yourself, right? And so there may be an effect like this occurring into this computational data set that refracts back information, just like our ocular centers, right? Just like the nerves, the image is being reversed. It's being reversed again as it travels back to the optical centers. And really what we're experiencing is again, proteins and light, right? Phenomenon bouncing off geometrical constants. So we really do see the world through this visual horizon that is based on the shape of the eye. And then you look at these 8 ocular muscles, right? And then you begin to see these sacred symbols, such as Metatron's cube or the tree of life. And you see in the center, you see these 6 points, right, surrounding a center. But then whenever you look at something like that, you live in a world where there's a plane. There is a definite right and left. Every single esoteric, arcane piece of artwork points at this. It points at this fact. It's giving you this huge cheat, right? But it's also saying if you go to the left, you go to the left-hand path, and you are more computationally based, you're living in a more reptilian type of a world, right? And if you go over here to the right, you're living in a more etheric place. And so you're not always going to see a direct outcome with when you say good and evil, when you're sacrificing yourself, like no good deed goes unpunished. It's almost like it's endless. You put in, you're expected to put in more and more and more, right? So I'm really trying to link all this together to where I'm not just looking at one aspect, where I'm going, okay, if we're talking about this theological phenomenon where people are viewing this as God, Satan, or devil, right? Demons, right? Contracts and pacts, blood oaths, things like this. When we take into the fact that when you're going through that phenomenon, there are numbers floating around your body. There are geometrical constants happening as a phenomenon around you. There's even a recording of these instances, right? Which many people would say is debatably so. But I've always been aware of this personally, that everything that we do is being recorded. But there's also a depiction and a recording that you could say gets into the Hall of Amante, or the Ashik records, or it's Akashic records, I think it is. It's viewed in a lot of different ways, right? So that there's this archive of information that would have to be stored in a data set where there would be so much information compiled, right, that it would have to be broken down into its rudimentary base, right? So in other words, We look at events. We look at the fact that there's redundancies over and over again. We're all making tuna sandwiches at some point in our life around the world. We're all watching a program, whether it's Seinfeld or you know, uh, Scavenger's Reign or whatever it might be. We're all reaching some level of sedentary enjoyment while we're eating that sandwich, right? There's these ubiquitous notions that are unnecessary to record, but they create a median sort of experience, right? That median experience and also more of an average experience, right? And also a heightened state of experience and also a very mundane lower status of experience, right? Where you have people who are not really experiencing at all. Well, there's certain aspects to that data set that are washed away. Only the highlighted areas of these peaks and valleys are what are going to go into these records, right? Because again, there's this condensing of bit file information that can be useful toward the next event, and this goes in cycles. So it really gets into this galactic cycle, this debatably, 12,000 to 14,000 year half cycle, right? And then this nearly 26,000 year full cycle, where you see this sort of sifting machine, a computational system occur, where if you are not making what you would consider within the mechanics of yourself moral strides within yourself that impress upon yourself greater information. In other words, it's so easy to go to the well every day when you know that water is there. You know the walk it's going to take, right? But some people live a great distance from that same well, and they will have to go through utter hell. I remember seeing something about this guy on these short videos where everybody lived nearby the schoolhouse, but he wanted to be educated so badly that in order for him to get to school, he had to literally go into this river holding all his school books over his head, right? And go on this mad walk just to get to school every single day. So can you say that the phenomenon, the local phenomenon of your experience is the same as this guy you're sitting next to, where you just walked or were dropped off by horse and buggy, horse, donkey, I don't know, hybrid vehicle, depends on the time, right? But how important is it for you to show up and you to give everything? And then even more so, are you just learning an indoctrination when you get to school, right? That it wasn't really about what you were learning, but that you came with everything you had. And therefore, as you went through school, there may have been somebody aware of you through these occult organizations that lined you up perfectly. And you kind of get into the Pope, like the current Pope, there's pictures of him meeting when he was very young. I think it was Pope John. He was meeting Pope John, right? And he was obviously extremely fascinated, right? And so you get into these nodes again of computational subsets and systems, and how through this redundancy pattern, you might see people, places, times, and events be completely erased, right? And there may be more than one potential to reach this higher status or higher state. That if you were to look at a Messiah figure or a Hitler type figure, or however you want to look at this, a satanic, like an Antichrist type figure, right? Whatever you're looking at the extremes through events, right? That led up to the totality of a story that could also be best depicted as a computational data set. A lot of the stuff that Cliff High looks at, right? Where he's looking at open source information, open source energy. And he said this in the past in his interviews that it's pretty crazy to think that people in mass collectively know what's going to happen next, to the point where you think that quite possibly the collective mind, the emotional collective mind that everything that's on the internet, what people say, what people post, all this information is taken in as a central data set. And you could even say the archive itself of data, to where if you were looking at a very low point in your life and then you looked at this upper high point, what are those points, right? And then even more so, you look at it in terms of these different layers of reality, right? When you were face to face with this very strange um, non non-corporeal or non-temporal, right, type of interaction that couldn't just merely be dismissed or explained by physical interaction, right? A materialistic type thought process through what Ayn Rand really gets into, which is like objectivism. To be selfish, to focus on yourself in order to come out with the best possible product of yourself, right? And most people would think that Marcus Aurelius was a great person until they start to look into the fact that he was probably an opium addict, right? So that kind of pops the bubble, right? Mother Teresa wasn't such a great person, right? She was tied in with needing to be looked at in everything that she did and noticed, and everything's documented, right? But a lot of the campaigns that she went on, where she was getting a lot of notoriety for helping people, they looked at the actual data and she wasn't really helping anybody, right? She was just appearing to help people in that moment at that time, but at the cost of a greater number of people, right? So when you get into this, it references something that was called at one time the 1001 Club, where you see this dichotomy of people doing great things on the planet. This is exactly what the Masons do. This is what the Hellfire Club did. Benjamin Franklin, right? This is what the Satanic Church, what motivated Anton LaVey, right? He's watching all these people that supposedly, these Masons most likely, running society, showing up for, church early. But the reason they showed up early because they were up all night. They probably still had the stink of all the vile things that they did the night before. And he's playing in a band. Anton LaVey is playing in a band until the wee hours of the night, right? Into the morning, watching these guys do the worst things, philandering. And then hours later, there they are in church. So you begin to see things where they understand this. They're playing with the process, and that they call each other brother, and that they live within a collective set where everything that they do needs to stay in balance, right? And they're not supposed to do too much good or too much evil, right? They're supposed to keep this certain balance. And in this, they're able to garner titleship and attention, doing business, right? Where they might be very philanthropic, but they're also enjoying those steaks, enjoying their hunting, right? They've come to the truth within themselves that you could say you'd look past the spiritual aspects of a wolf, right? And you'd see that the wolf has a behavior where it ultimately knows it's going to be out there again. It's going to have to fend for itself. It knows intrinsically within itself that it's going to be going through these terrible winters, that it's going to be attacked by other animals. So this whole idea of fang, right? Or tusk, right? That you've got this idea a priori, right? Of this eternal truth that I'm going to be put back into the system that is not going to be fun, and I'm going to have to stay suffering so that I can keep a thick skin and keep going out there. Well, that's kind of what the Mason implies, right? Is that we're going to be man, and all we really know of man, other than sort of spiritual or theological moral conjecture, is that man has to be vile and dirty at times in order to progress. Man has to be compassionate and nurturing at certain times to where he's going to help out an orphanage, right? But you get into these people like Aleister Crowley who go into these occult rituals, right? And you see this heavily fully manifested with Jack Parsons' life, how he passed away, the things that he was doing, where he was going into this Babylon working and actually trying to, and successfully, as he says, manifesting an actual child from these rituals, right? From these cycles. Like, we're not just talking about going in and doing something as an experimental process. We're talking about looking at the calendric cycle, many different cycles, the zodiac, right, as an event, and doing this when something so epic like the atomic bomb was being detonated, right? So you get into these areas that are very spooky. And again, the reference that I'd leave you with, so that you're not just looking into Amon Hillman and going down that rabbit hole, because you can go down some very dark places. I can tell you that because I've been through them. And Jason Riza Georgiani really lays all the information out on his Substack channel, with something that he wrote about Amon Hillman a couple of months ago, right? And it is very interesting stuff. He's laying out the pharmacon, the types of mushrooms, the things that were used at a certain time and how they were used through the occult, right? But he calls it this Gorgic energy, which is like this terrible, disgusting, vile energy, right? That has been perpetuated and culminated and called upon, right? So we really want to see if this is the main question, right? This brings it all up to a head, to a central point, and that is that are we looking at a creature, an entity of the collective mind that is everything from the computational system that's very digitized in its way to this very flesh-based, emotional Plutchik's wheel type of scenario, right? And in the center, we kind of have this Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and placing transcendence at the top, right? And that it really isn't this complex system. It just happens to have more layers from a doxastic sense than we're traditionally trained to or used to seeing or identifying, right? And that we need to identify as many of these points as we can, but without sort of like losing our souls, right, through the process. Because what we see is even the most moral perturbations don't necessarily cost you a soul. In fact, it can build one up. So back to the point is this depiction of Abraxas, right, throughout antiquity, the actual entity that we're looking at, where there's this chimera, this homogeneous amalgamation of good and evil at the highest parameters, not even imaginable to us, where you would see the most heinous ritualistic sacrifices go on and on and on. And most people would be like, where's God, right? Where's this benevolent Santa Claus type God creature? And then you look over here on the right and you see these long stretches of time with these nearly angelic, some would even go as far as to say Atlantean or Lemurian type entities that lived in this cultivated state of bliss, right? That some people would look at more like Valhalla, some people Shambhala. And then while there's going on 2 billion people of the Islamic traditions would look at this as, going to a place where you have all these virgins and wealth, right? So you're going into another, really, it's just another carnal realm, right? But you're going into this higher status of a carnal realm. You also get into areas like the Dunye, right? So when you begin to look at this, is Abraxas correct? Or is this seeing a dichotomy, right? Where these computational subsets, and even more so, you could take purity and perfection, the tree of knowledge or physical wisdom, but it's the tree of wisdom, or do you have this tree of purity, right? For lack of a better, right? It's really about this tree, this subset of a tree of purity. Which tree do you choose to go to time and time again? And you'll think that you're doomed. You'll think that you did such things that there's no return. You're still alive. You're still breathing. The clock's still ticking. The test is still taking place. And so, what a lot of people, I think, do is they fall into this trap where they've done such heinous things that they hate themselves. And for the rest of their lives, they beat themselves down. And this is why the Masons catch people like this, right? Where they go, look, if you really are of a higher mind and you think that you have this higher mind, well, we believe that as heinous as you were, right, that you just didn't have the proper application and that you have the ability to do great things, right, as a parameter, right? The depths that you could go to are the very heights that you could go to as well. So that's something that really seems very obvious, but it's always on the plate. It's always what we're playing with. And then this leads directly into a paracosm that we really do each only have our own world. We really only do ever have our own experiences, our own cause and effect, the ultimate outcome, right? And we all do feel, most people that I talk to don't feel blessed. They feel cursed, right? And it comes down to a lot of like what my son's doing right now, where he's on disability, right? He's on a fixed income and he really can't mess that up, but he needs to find meaning and a higher form of expression in doing something. So I'm proud of him, what led him to SPCA. And then you can see that as a dichotomy as well, right? Where you could say, oh, well, that's, euthanasia. You could go work here. Look, it's about what you give where you're at. You cannot miss the point. Wherever you end up and whatever circumstances you're in, you have that shit aspect of yourself. So in a sense, you are very much like an Abraxas. You and I both. We're like an Abraxas type character. We're this chimera amalgamation, homogenized sense of bits and pieces and parts of epigenetics, right? Synthetic a priori, a posteriori, that creates this paracosm or collectivism with our Welt, our Umwelt, our Weltanschauung, our Weltanschauung Krieg, right? That ultimately creates this dichotomy between phenomenon and noumenon, right? And so it depends on the margin that you live in, the parameters, but even more so, collectively amassing all this information, taking this on, right? Getting past the point where you're just merely admitting things that you've done to yourself, or going through psychology where you're yelling at some chair of some parent that you never get to talk to or that died off, right? To the where you're just oversupplying what could be called, like, in a sense, they're turning people into sociopaths when they do that, right? Because they're saying your experience is real and that's all that matters. After, paying all this money to a psychotherapist or a psychologist, right? That you end up at this place where it's like, well, guess what? You're still having to face yourself and the actual acts and the deeds. So we want to think that the outside world and the people in our community judge us at a ever higher level than we're able to judge ourselves, because we feel the stones being thrown. We feel assaulted, right? And we wonder, was this warranted? And then when we come down to it, we're like, oh, yes. But the truth is that look how that energy jumped the gun to chastise you, right? To try and box you in, mentor you through disciplinary means where you didn't get a chance to refract what you did on yourself, right? Because you were going through this heightened state of PTSD, right? Amygdala response, limbic system firing, right? Where you never got to get to this place where you were in this self-contained world or paracosm, where you could also fully see and experience the outside, not just with your visual horizons. So this lends back to what I'm getting back into, is how profound the protein diet, from a spiritual sense, of oversaturating your system with proteins, drinking so much water, moving constantly, right? I'm not recommending this to anybody. I'm just describing my own personal experience that I reached this heightened state of spiritual, profound experience. And I realized that I'm not bound. That's just what the body experienced. And the body itself was sort of bound to a karma that I come to realize through my life, right? Through these heightened states of experience that I am not bound to myself. It's just a digital construct, right? That you're being put in this meat suit that's actually a digitized construct, a software, if you will. There's plenty of people who talk about this, from Kant to Joseph Bach to many other people. Even Michael Levin might even hint at this, right? Because he's looking at these microorganisms, the xenobots, right? These antibiotics, and he's looking at them and he's going, even down here at this micro scalable level with these bullfrog embryo cells, I am seeing that this little guy has his own agency. He's remembering things. We can't even find a brain here, right? So then we begin to, again, loop back on Michael Persinger's God helmet, and then directly tying in what Dr. Michael Levin is looking at in his research, that you're always going to see life itself as manifested as an electromagnetic event.